Well, yes, you may wonder why we left off where we did last week. And the reason is, of course, because the account of Daniel, if you took the whole of chapter 2 in one sermon, we'd probably be here until tea time, because there really is so much packed into this chapter. So we've split it into 3. So Robert, as we've heard, left us on a real cliffhanger last week with the king had a dream, and he wanted his wise men to tell him what his dream was and then to interpret it. And the wise men said, nobody can do that. Don't be ridiculous, Nebuchadnezzar. Don't be ridiculous. Nobody can do that. So the king said, kill a lot of them. They're all useless. Get rid of them. I wonder sometimes if sometimes it can seem to you like you're in a position where the whole world is against you. Imagine what Daniel felt like at that point. Hopeless. Literally hopeless. Within whatever hours, a day, who knows, he was going to meet his maker, because there was no way out. He was in a big black hole. We can feel similar to that at times, when we feel we've got nowhere to turn, no allies we can turn to. We feel that we're sinking and we think, help, there's no way out. What am I going to do? Perhaps we have difficult decisions to make, and every decision, every way forward seems a wrong one in one way or another. Perhaps we have family issues, and they just seem so insurmountable that we'll never overcome them. And we just feel hopeless in a big black hole. Maybe professional decisions to make in our job. And whatever way we go, somebody's going to get hurt, something is not going to work out, and it just seems a hopeless position. Maybe even friends turn against us and we feel alone, like Daniel. In times like that, it is in times like that when we may struggle to sleep. Even those of us who have no problems sleeping. I have no problem sleeping. I'm one of those lucky people. I slept through my alarm clock this morning, and had Julie not come and woken me up, I'd probably still be there now. Sleeping isn't a problem for me, generally. But I know that when I struggle, when I feel like I've got big decisions to make and there doesn't seem to be an easy answer, even for me, sleep, as somebody once said, she doesn't come. Sleep, she doesn't come. And we awake in the middle of the night. We awake early in the morning and can't get back to sleep again. We walk around all day in a daze because we haven't had enough sleep, which makes the worrying worse. When we do sleep, it's light sleep and we toss and turn. We have possibly bad dreams and maybe even nightmares that wake us in a cold sweat, fearful and confused. What is going to happen? That's what Nebuchadnezzar was like. The good news is that in times like these, they don't usually last forever. Normally, those times will pass. Something will happen. Maybe we will have to make a difficult decision, and people might even get hurt, but the time will pass. Friendships will be rebuilt. And the important thing to remember is, if you ever feel like that, you are not alone. You may not have many human friends around you, but you always have God, as we will see. Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful man in the world. That is beyond doubt. There is no question. In the entire world, there was nobody that could top him. Nebuchadnezzar had found that he could conquer nations around him with a wave of his hand. Army, go and get that nation for me. And they'd fall to his great power. Nebuchadnezzar had found that he could have whatever he wanted, simply for the asking. Get that for me, get this for me, and it would come. He was that powerful. More frighteningly, he knew that he could send a man to his death or a woman to her death with a word. That's all it took. off with their heads, and they were gone. But the amazing thing is, despite all that power, despite all his wealth, despite all his possessions, despite everything, he couldn't control his anxiety. That's quite frightening, isn't it? Even though he had absolutely everything, he could not control his anxiety. It strikes me that people with the most to lose worry the most about losing it. If you haven't got anything, you can't worry. If you've got more stuff, you worry more. That was Nebuchadnezzar's problem. He was the epitome of having stuff and the epitome of worry as well. And his worry, just as we said earlier, kept him awake at night. It kept him tossing and turning on his bed, unable to sleep, nightmares, dreams, all kinds of terrible things. One night, he had a dream that we thought about last week. Robert took us through it. And that dream was so troubling that he was unable to work out what to do about it. He couldn't work out which way to turn, because in Nebuchadnezzar's culture, dreams were very significant. They were taken very seriously. And if you had a dream, it meant something. And very often, you wouldn't know what it meant. You might just know what the dream was, so you called upon some wise person to interpret the dream for you. That's what Nebuchadnezzar did. But Nebuchadnezzar, yes, he called on somebody to interpret, but Nebuchadnezzar didn't tell those wise men what his dream was. And again, we thought about that last week. Why didn't he? Either he'd forgotten, as you might, or he was testing. I think more likely he was testing these wise men. If you are really wise, you'll know my dream and you'll be able to interpret it. Now, just let's take an aside at this point for one moment, because it's worth remembering this. While Daniel and his friends were experiencing God's absence, bear that in mind. Daniel and his friends had been wrenched from their homes and families, taken away by a conquering king, that had their godly names changed to pagan abominations. They'd become simply trophies of Nebuchadnezzar's conquest. We see in this passage that Nebuchadnezzar had added them to his cohort of wise men. Perhaps to bring a different perspective, that's all they were. They were playthings for Nebuchadnezzar. Where was God with Daniel and his friends? Seems like God was really absent, doesn't it? But at that same time, while God was absent from the godly people, he was speaking to the godless king. That's quite hard to get your head around sometimes, isn't it? He was speaking to the godless Nebuchadnezzar, their pagan captor. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar didn't know at this point that it was God speaking to him. He had no desire to know God. He was the wealthiest, most powerful man in the world. Why would he want to know God? He had all he wanted. Yet God was speaking to him, and he would find that out. So let's reflect on that and see, even when God seemed completely absent, humanly speaking, God was still at work. God had not lost the plot. God had not forgotten Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He'd not forgotten them, though on the ground it might have felt like he had. His plan was in action. God knew what he was doing. We need to be reminded that God's ways are not our ways. So easy at times, isn't it, for us to try and tell God what he should be doing or how he should be acting, rather than submitting to his providence. That's a hard lesson to learn. But it's one that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah all did learn. Now, somehow, getting back to Nebuchadnezzar and this dream he had, he recognized that his dream was significant, that it meant something, although he didn't know what. And last week, Robert took us through his actions. And there were actions that terminated with this: kill all the wise men, as I said a moment ago. Kill them all. Look down at verse 12 we looked at last week. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed. At the very point the sword was hovering over their necks, and then Daniel came. But bear in mind, at this point as well, the text tells us that Daniel and his friends were among the wise men. Sometimes, I'd never really spotted this before. I've kind of thought of Daniel and his friends as being separate, living their own lives on their own, away from everything. But no, they weren't. According to this passage here, they lived among the wise men. They were counted among the wise men. Things were going from bad to worse for these young men. But then, in the passage that's before us today, following on from last week, we have what I've called a Daniel sandwich. It's not actually a Daniel sandwich. It's a God sandwich, because if Daniel is the bread, not the filling, God is the filling. So I'm calling it a Daniel sandwich because it's easier to remember. Okay? So here we are, a Daniel sandwich. We have Daniel's actions, then we have God's actions, and then we have Daniel's response. First then, Daniel's actions. What does he do? Daniel was methodical and careful. He was level-headed and calm. When we read about Daniel's actions here, verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. There's no sense of panic here, even though the sword was on his neck. There's no sense of panic. There's a sense of calm honoring for God. And he went to his friends and he made 3 requests. The first thing he asked for was time from the king. And look at how calm and measured he is, verse 16. Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Now, if I was Daniel and I had a sword on my neck about to die, I don't think I'd be able to go into the king and say, "Oh, king, please, can you just give me a bit more time?" I think it'd be far more likely that I'd be falling on my face before him and saying, "Please, king, please, don't do it, please help me." But as we read verse 16, it doesn't read like that, does it? It reads like Daniel has a calm confidence that whatever happens, God is in control. Requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. And the king granted Daniel's request. What a brave action that was. Somebody wrote this: when Daniel was told he would be executed, he did not respond with defensiveness and anger, but spoke to the commander with wisdom and tact. Wow, amazing. What an amazing thing to do. The king granted his request, and the second thing Daniel did then, first he asked the king for time, second he asked his friends for advice and assistance. Now this is very helpful as well, isn't it? Look at verse 17. Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. He went and he sought his friends out, his believing friends, and he said, "We've got to sort this out. We've got to do something here. Let's see what we can do to help God, so that God can act to sort this out." Sometimes in a crisis, it's easy for us either to put up the barriers and to say, "Nobody can help me. I'm on my own. Nobody can help me with this. This is so bad, so difficult. I'm on my own." That can be a fatal way of dealing with times like this. literally. The second thing people do, or the second mistake people make, is go to just anybody to give advice. Daniel didn't do that. He didn't go to all the wise men and say, what can we do about it? He went to his believing godly friends who had the same worldview, the same knowledge of God, the same belief in God, the same faith in God, as we'll see when we get to chapter 3 that we heard about earlier on. He went to those people and sought advice, solace, comfort, help. He invited faithful friends. He went to the king and asked for time. He helped. He did what he could to delay the situation. He then went and asked his friends for assistance. And the third and most significant thing he did was he asked the Lord for mercy. Verse 18. Let's read verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Seek mercy, fall on your knees, said Daniel. Seek mercy from God. Because God holds this in his hands. It's in his hands. Somebody wrote this. They felt the urgency, they felt their helplessness, and they knew that only God was great enough to perform such a miracle. It's quite a lesson to learn, isn't it? In their depths of what could, humanly speaking, be absolute despair, this is the end. They fell on their knees and called on God for mercy. Sometimes people say, well, God has deserted me. He's not interested in me anymore. I don't feel his presence anymore. Why should I bother with him now? That's completely the wrong response. When God feels a long way from you, the correct response is to fall on your knees and plead with him for mercy. We need to be ready to share our difficulties and our joys with others, just as Daniel did. He didn't keep them to himself, he shared them. And we need to learn to pray for and with one another. We don't do that enough. It's not in a judgmental, preachy kind of way. You know, the kind of prayers that preach to the person you're praying for when they're there. I'm sure their prayers were not like that. They were approaching the throne of grace. Simply bearing one another's burdens helps far more than any kind of preachy praying in those difficult situations. If we learn to do that, to bear one another's burdens, to help one another through difficult times, to rejoice with one another when times are good, if we learn to do that, then we'll see God at work. We'll really see God at work. I know we're seeing God at work now, but do we want to see him at work more? The Apostle Paul understood this when he wrote in his second letter to the church at Corinth. Chapter 1, verse 9, he wrote this. We felt that we'd received the sentence of death, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. You also must help us by prayer, so that many will give thanks on our behalf for the blessing granted us through the prayers of many. They were at their wits' end, says Paul. They thought that was it. But because people prayed for them, they knew God's blessing. And what a witness that is. That's the base piece of bread in our Daniel sandwich. Then comes the filling, which is actually not many words, but says more than almost anything. It's, here we are, I've lost it. God's actions. We've had Daniel's actions, now we've got God's actions. Here, in the middle of our Daniel sandwich, we find just half a verse. Here it is, verse 19. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in the vision of the night. Half a verse. But isn't that's the most incredible half a verse probably in the whole of the book of Daniel. Exactly what the king had been asking for. This is exactly what's going to get them off the hook, away from the executioner's blade, whatever. God heard and God answered. God answered faithful prayer in the midst of desperation. God heard and God answered. All we get is half a verse. Sometimes God's answers to prayers can seem almost insignificant, so that we don't notice. But sometimes they can be just amazing. Because of that half a verse, many lives were saved. We don't know how many. All the wise men, their lives were saved because of half a verse. And half a verse that came about because 4 people prayed. And the lives of these 4 godly men were also saved because God had plans for them, as we'll see in subsequent weeks. This one answer, this half a verse in the middle of chapter 2, shows that God cares for his faithful servants. He's not going to let them down. He hasn't let them down. It shows us that God is greater than any other gods. None of the wise men could interpret the king's dream, tell him what it was and tell him what it meant. Nobody. But God could. It tells us this, that God is greater even than Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man in the world. God is even greater. And as we read on through the book of Daniel, we find that the contents of Nebuchadnezzar's dream say exactly that. Kingdoms rise, kingdoms fall, but our God goes on forever. Nebuchadnezzar, you've got a great kingdom now. One day it will fall. Somebody else will take your place, but God will still be God. That's the message that's coming. So, spoiler alert again. Sorry about that. So, Daniel's actions. God's actions. The top piece of bread in our sandwich is Daniel's response. What would you do? Did you breathe a sigh of relief? Whew, saved. That was a close one. Well, Daniel's first reaction was to give thanks to God. Verse 19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Blessed there simply means gave thanks to. He gives thanks to the God of heaven. And Daniel prays this prayer that's written down in the form of a psalm from verses 20 to 23. And it tells us this, the context of Daniel's prayer was that God is eternal. Verse 20, we haven't got time to look at these in detail, so note these down and look for yourselves afterwards. God is eternal. Second, God is powerful, verse 21. And third, God knows everything. He is eternal, he is powerful, he is all-knowing, verse 22 and 23. First thing then Daniel did after this answer to prayer is that he fell on his knees and he gave thanks to God. And I'm sure that the other 3 were there with him. And they gave thanks to God together. Because it's always more joyful to do something like that together than it is on your own. The next thing Daniel did in response was that he went back to Nebuchadnezzar. Look at verse 24. Therefore Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to them, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. He went back to Arioch, who was appointed to destroy the wise men, meaning Daniel as well. He went into his executioner and said, take me to see the king, because I can sort out his problem. Daniel went this time not saying, please give me time, please be gracious and give me time. He went this time, having prayed and having received an answer and having given thanks to God, he went in with boldness and said, I can sort the king's problem now. It's quite a difference, isn't it? The difference that praying together, working things out together, giving thanks to God together brought such boldness to Daniel. He now knew what the king wanted, and he asked Arioch to take him in, and that's exactly what happened. And then the third thing that Daniel does in this top layer, bottom layer, whichever it is of the sandwich, is this. He challenges Nebuchadnezzar's worldview. Now talk about boldness. Here's the most powerful man in the world. He challenges his worldview. Verse 26 says this. The king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream that I've seen and its interpretation?" Daniel answered the king and said, look where he starts. "No wise man, enchanter, magician, astrologer can show the king this mystery the king has asked, but there is a God who can." He doesn't say, "Yes, king, I'll ask, I've got the answer for you." He says, "God has given you the answer. Your magicians couldn't do it. Your worldview is wrong, Nebuchadnezzar, because you put your faith and trust in all these magicians here. Well, only God can give you the answer." The great theologian of the Reformation, John Calvin, wrote this. The king uses these words through his despair of all interpretation. For he was at first persuaded that the Magi alone were the possessors of wisdom. The Magi, the wise men. Through surprise, then, here he inquires, "Have you that power?" Amazing witness to Nebuchadnezzar. He thought, if my wise men can't do it, nobody can. In comes Daniel. He says, "Okay, Daniel, you think you can do it? Off you go then." And Daniel does. And Daniel answers again with boldness and clarity. Not to save his own stake, but to present the glory and greatness of God to Nebuchadnezzar. See, what matters to Daniel far more than his own life is the glory of God. He persuaded the king that God had the answer. But he also persuaded the king that God knew what the king's real needs were. And they're not the same thing. The answer to a presenting problem is not always the same thing as what a person needs when faced with that problem. Do you see the different things with Nebuchadnezzar? He thought his problem was understanding the dream. His real problem was not trusting God. Your gods have been shown to be false, says Daniel. Our God holds the answers. Verse 28, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be put in the latter days. Our God holds the answers. Our God, says Daniel, our God controls history. Not you, Nebuchadnezzar. Our God. Verse 29, to you, O king, as you lay in the bed came thoughts of what would be after this. And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. Our God is in control. It's a fantastic, amazing, challenging account, isn't it? It's not about Daniel at all. It's about God. It's about the power of God. It's about the ways of God. And it's about how we can know him and relate to him, how he can help even the most difficult people with the most intractable problems. God is the answer. That's what Daniel is saying here. So let's try and remember some of the lessons we've learned along the way. I want to try and encourage you again to pray more with other people. And when you're facing issues, to pray with other people about them. And one of the key things is not primarily to seek an answer to the issue, but to seek the God who holds the answer. Then we'll see God work. Let's bow our heads to pray.